Welcome, everybody. We are so happy to look out and see a wonderful audience for this great next session. And we're really proud to have Nicholas Boggs with us with his incredibly gorgeous book on Baldwin. James Baldwin is one of the 20th century's luminary minds, a writer who was witness to the world in its complicated darkness and in its remarkable light. One of America's clearest moral and cultural leaders, his life and legacy are redefined in this new book, a biography years in the making. Nicholas Boggs embarked on a years-long odyssey of discovery in this stunning new biography, the first major comprehensive view into Baldwin's world in over 30 years. Looking through a lens of love with 4 key figures in Baldwin's life, Baldwin, a love story, illuminates this complex, extraordinary journey of a man who shaped American art and activism. Joining Nicholas is Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Mitchell Jackson. His work from feature reporting to his books, The Residue Years, Survival Math, and Fly, has made his a voice for our times. It is a privilege to welcome Nicholas Boggs and Mitchell Jackson.
Hello. How you doing? Great, great. So great to see all these faces out here braving this humidity at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. We appreciate it. Brother Boggs, I ain't seen you in a minute, man. You've been having quite the time since I seen you.
I have to say, 11 a.m. is, at this hour, James Baldwin would be very much asleep.
Yeah. He would have just went to sleep.
Yeah, exactly.
After some drinking.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And some writing.
Yeah. I want to reiterate how much I really love this biography and what you've done with it, how much care you took with it, and obviously how much fortitude it takes to write and work on a project that long. And also, just for everyone else, we've had one of these conversations before, and I had 20 questions in, and I erased the 20 questions and came up with some new questions just so we weren't repeating. This first question is, early in the book, you write about Baldwin putting the pennies on his eyes to kind of push back the bulge of them, and going to a movie and seeing Betty Davis had similar eyes and giving him confidence, which made me think about the beauty myth, and one of the first people that affirmed it. But more importantly, I was thinking, do you see any connection between, well, let me back up. I often think of the beauty myth as applying to women. But I think in the case of Baldwin, like he's also beholden to a kind of unattainable European idealized standard of beauty. And reading that passage again made me think of this current craze, which I can't really understand, of looks maxing. And also, which I think to be grounded in European beauty standards. So do you see any connection between what Baldwin was going through as a young person and this kind of current craze of however you want to define looks maxing?
Wow, okay, you always know that Mitchell's gonna come up with some new questions that you did not expect. Looks maxing was not on my list. I don't really know what that is, except sometimes I see something flash by me on social media. So let me just start by describing Baldwin's situation, right? This is actually the opening of the book, is that he's been taken to the movie theater. He's 10 years old by a white school teacher because he's very precocious at school, it's Harlem school, and so the teachers hooked him up with this kind of visiting teacher, and she would take him to see plays and movies and really changed his life. And this moment was important. He saw is it 30,000 Years in Sing Sing, or 20,000, with Betty Davis. And as soon as he saw Betty Davis on the screen, he had a major epiphany. And this was because he'd been grown up being told by his father that he was ugly, that he had frog eyes, that he was the ugliest boy in the world, and his eyes looked just like his mother's eyes. And what he didn't know at the time is that this was not his biological father. And part of what this father was saying was, you're ugly because you're not actually mine.
Yeah.
And so Baldwin took this moment, this look-smacking moment, I guess, but what he did that was so interesting, instead of kind of like idealizing the whiteness of Betty Davis and wanting to be white, he said, I turned her skin green. And so he kind of identified with her, but also transformed her into something else. And that's something that I think he did in his writing throughout his life.
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm gonna stay a little bit on this masculinity, beauty, mythology. You write that Baldwin was redefining masculinity in another country. I think that the kind of current potency of the manosphere is a response to a more recent redefinition of masculinity, which is to me a form of resentment. So I wonder, what do you think about this relationship between a redefining of masculinity and then what comes after it, and maybe relating that to how Baldwin was doing it?
These are totally new questions, and I'm prepared, and I'm here for it. Let's get into it. I mean, I think one of the things about Baldwin is that he was on these journeys. Okay, so that first journey from this seeing Betty Davis was kind of part of his journey towards self-love, right? He went through in his life, and part of that journey was also redefining masculinity. So Baldwin, even though he was sort of identifying with a woman, there were times in his life, and we've probably seen them, those of you who watch YouTube on TV, where he's kind of doing this macho posturing, right? And there were times when, quite rightly, black feminists were critiquing him. Audre Lorde, Nikki Giovanni, had problems with this kind of recapitulation of kind of patriarchal statements. But later in his life, he was really, this is part of what's great about looking at Baldwin's later work, which is what people don't usually consider. They think there's this narrative of his decline as an artist, and many Baldwin scholars, but also in this book, are sort of looking at the later works. He was writing about gender in ways that were so beyond those times. He was in a Playboy essay in 1986, he starts by saying we're all androgynous. Each contains the other, male and female, female and male, black and white, white and black.
Yeah.
So he was having this really, really kind of radical relationship to gender that I think had been impacted by his friendships with people like Maya Angelou, especially Toni Morrison. So he was redefining masculinity in his early novels already by going into sort of the problems, mostly, not exclusively, but very much the problems of white masculinity and the connection between whiteness and masculinity and patriarchy and these norms, which, as you said, yes, from what I know of this movement you're describing, they are reasserting themselves, and they're reasserting themselves in part as a reaction against trans identities, for sure.
Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned his conversations and friendships with Maya Angelou and Audre Lorde, because I was having a conversation with my brother just the other day. We were talking about black women unemployment, which actually Angela mentioned during her talk as well, and how I was arguing that it was like basically such a critical moment. He was like, yeah, man, but the black men got it tough too. And I was like, yeah, but if we got it tough, black women got it tougher. And I think that failure to see the intersectionality of oppression is a problem for black men. And I want to overlay that over the conversation that Baldwin had with Audre Lorde when they were talking about the American dream. And, you're talking about him being so far ahead of where we were in 1950s and 1960s, but it also seems to me a kind of blind spot in Baldwin's kind of early thinking about the intersectionality. And that's just me thinking, so I want to hear the expert on this.
we have to think historically. I mean, Baldwin was doing so much before anybody else was doing it,
Yeah.
right? Like writing Giovanni's Room, a gay novel that was rejected by Knopf in the early 50s, then, you know, from the perspective of a white author, exploring the kind of love triangle there. I mean, you could argue that David was kind of a misogynist, and he was, but that doesn't mean that Baldwin was. Baldwin was representing the kind of misogyny that's baked into patriarchy and whiteness, right? So I think he was already thinking through these issues, but in some of his public performances, he wasn't being as progressive. But you have to remember, one of the things, the great deadlocks that Baldwin helped 20th century, I think, African-American writing break out of, was this model of there can only be one great Black writer, and usually has to be male. So he was in that deadlock with Richard Wright, and we know he came for Richard Wright, wrote a very mean essay about him, and part of that was finding his voice as a writer, but part of it is that he was trapped in that model. I think one of the things that's beautiful about Baldwin's development, and he learned this from Black women, is that this kind of combative, Oedipal, whatever you want to call it, model wasn't going to work for him. And later in his life, that's why he was championing writers like Toni Morrison, Gail Jones, you know, other women writers. He helped us break out of this model where there could only be one.
Yeah, I love that idea of challenging that notion. There's a moment where you write about, I think it's after Giovanni's Room, where Baldwin kind of loses anonymity. And if I go back maybe, God, this has to be like 15 years, I was at John Jay College in New York, and they had a reading of Stephen King. He was visiting to read. And obviously everyone in this room knows who Stephen King is and how many books he sold, right? Or movies. And so they had tables laid out of King's books and went from this side of the room to the other side of the room, stacked up high, books, 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 books. And then I saw Stephen King walk in, and he walked by the books and he went into the auditorium. And there were no students who was like, is that Stephen King? Like, no one, as far as I could tell, noticed this guy. And it made me think about the anonymity of being a writer. Now, here Baldwin is in the 1950s losing that anonymity. And I wondered, I don't think that there is at least a Black writer who has that kind of cultural authority and presence. So what was it about the 1950s and 60s that pedestaled Baldwin in that way that is no longer a part of our culture now, if I'm right?
Well, I think it really was actually the 60s. The 50s, you know, Go Tell the Mountain was well received, Giovanni's Room came out, it was well received, but it really was with the publication of The Fire Next Time in the country in the early 60s, and really when he landed on the cover of Time magazine in 1963. That is when he became a household name. That's when he was on television all the time. That is when he couldn't walk down the street without having autographs. So that is when the change happened for him. And that is when, and he had a very difficult time during that period. I mean, that is also when he would, I mean, he'd already left for France, as most people probably know, in the late 40s as a young man. But over in France, he became so well known, too, that he actually ended up going to Istanbul. And he spent, most people don't know this, but almost all of the 60s living in Istanbul. He called it his home. He would come back for the March on Washington. He would come back for Selma. He would come back to do Southern tours with CORE, et cetera. But he came back to meet with RFK. All these high-profile, history-making, history-changing sort of experiences, but his home was Istanbul. He followed this Turkish actor Engin Cezar there, a friend who he's sort of in love with. He was embraced by the Turkish intelligentsia and artists and radicals, and that's where he wrote he finished Another Country there at a party, back in a kitchen, you know, Turkish hors d'oeuvres everywhere. He wrote most of The Fire Next Time there. He wrote Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, his underrated novel. He directed a play there. So Baldwin was he called himself a transatlantic commuter. And Baldwin loved fame. He wanted to be famous. His junior high school yearbook, it says his line that fame is the spur, but ouch. And he wanted to be famous, and it was painful for him in many ways. He was being followed by the FBI. I mean, there were really negative aspects of the fame. He was drinking way too much, and so he needed these respites. He needed Paris, he needed Istanbul, and eventually he needed the south of France.
Yeah. I want to stick there. Speak to this idea of home. One of my favorite quotes about home is Toni Morrison, Baldwin's friend, who says, quote, "Home is memory and companions and our friends who share the same memory." And your friend Salman once said, "You can never go home again." So Baldwin seemed to me pretty nomadic. I wondered, first of all, what do you think his definition of home is compared to theirs? But also, where was home for Baldwin? Like, was it really ever Harlem again once he left?
That's a great question, and I think one of the things that I try to explore in the book is how he was nomadic. He was a transatlantic commuter, and he had to create these homes. He loved his family. He was very close with his family in Harlem. He actually ended up buying them a brownstone-ish townhouse on West 71st Street. But he spent all of these years abroad. He had to create these alternative kinship structures, these alternative homes in different places. He once said, perhaps home is an irrevocable condition rather than like a place necessarily. But I think this was one of the great struggles of his life was how to balance the fame, the need to create art, the need to engage politically, and the possibility of having some kind of sanctuary, some kind of home. Eventually, he purchased his house in St. Paul-de-Vence in the south of France, and I think that did become like it was his final home, and I think he did find some measure of peace, although people would come and bother him there, and he'd have to leave and go somewhere else.
Yeah.
So it was a constant back and forth.
One thing I think that Baldwin don't get enough credit for is he was like the king of friends with benefits.
That should have been the title. Man.
There we go. This is a republication. Baldwin, a love story. The king of friends with benefits. In Bell Hooks' All About Love, she writes, "Genuine love is rarely an emotional space where needs are instantly gratified. To know love, we have to invest time and commitment, dreaming that love will save us, solve all of our problems, or provide a steady state of bliss or security, only keep us stuck in wishful fantasy, undermining the real power of love." And To Crush a Serpent, Baldwin writes, "Complexity is our only safety, and love is the key to our maturity." How would you describe Baldwin's idea of love and also its evolution? And do you see it, like I think of maturity and a love devoid of wishful fantasy as kind of connected. Do you see any kind of tendon between those two ideas?
Well, Baldwin always said that love is a war, love is a battle, love is a growing up. That's his sort of famous line. And he really did not see love in this sort of saccharine sense. So even though he had these great romances, for him, love was this kind of truthful, almost brutal truth relationship between two people. He said, the role, and he actually related this to the role of the artist in America, which is the role of the artist and the role of the lover is the exact same thing. It's to force your beloved to see the parts of themselves that they can't see, and therefore make freedom real. I mean, the interesting thing about friends with benefits, now that you put it that way, is that one way that I understood Baldwin's relationships with these men in his life, Lucien Happersberger, Joran Kazak, Engin Jazar, all of whom I explore in the book, is he had these great loves with them that were only partially requited, or they would break up and get back together, and there was a lot of drama, and it was this kind of tough, brutal love. Baldwin would accept nothing less than this kind of this truthful relationship. He had that same relationship with America. His love with America was an impossible love, and he kept an impossible democratic ideal. And he kept breaking up with America and going to Istanbul or France, and then going back, getting back to Writing the Fire Next Time, which was full of actually hope and possibilities, interracial coalition. Then he gets disillusioned, he moves back again, and then he writes No Name in the Street, where he's pissed off at America. So this was part of his relationship relations with people, but it was also part of his relation to nation and to America and to the creative process.
Oh, man, I really love that. I want to talk about seeing. The first picture in the book, if I'm not mistaken, is Baldwin and Buford.
For Betty Davis, for the prologue, but book one, yes.
Yes, book one, yes.
Book one.
Okay. And Buford is one of the first people who teach Baldwin how to see. And how to see as an artist. As far as I know, there are fewer tyrants who were artists. Like, I know Hitler painted or something, so I'm not saying that you can not be an aspiring artist or a thwarted artist and not become someone very terrible. But I would argue that the way that an artist sees the world is almost an inoculation against some of our worst tendencies. So if Baldwin was taught to see as an artist very early on in his life, and that helped him see when he was leaving America and coming back and giving us all this prescient information about our struggle, what do you think that us, the common people who are not artists, can learn from that way of seeing?
So Baldwin wrote about Buford Delaney, the great African-American painter whose paintings are now worth millions of dollars. He wrote of him, all great art is created out of love, and no greater lover ever held a brush than Buford. And he means love not in a necessarily erotic, romantic sense. And for those who don't know, the story, just briefly, is that Baldwin was 16 years old. He was working at a sweatshop after school, and a friend of his from his magnet school in the Bronx had told him about this eccentric Black American painter, Buford, who lived in the village, and you have to meet him. So Baldwin went down to his, after work, he went there very nervously, climbed the tenement stairs on Green Street, knocked on the door. He opens the door, and there's this short brown man with eyes kind of like his, and behind him are all these easels that are covered in white sheets. And Baldwin comes in, and Buford removes the sheets. And what does he see? All of these paintings of jazz musicians and street scenes and portraits of Black people. And Baldwin never knew you could be an artist. He said, this was when I realized that a Black man could be an artist. Remember, Baldwin was not allowed to read in his home, except for the Bible, which he finished in like 2 days. And he was not allowed to listen to music. So Buford also played jazz and blues from him. He took him backstage to meet Marian Anderson at Carnegie Hall, and Fats Waller. He met all of these people. So Buford was this incredible portal to possibility for Baldwin. And he loved Baldwin. He also, and it's complicated, he also had kind of a romantic crush on Baldwin. And this is just one instance of how Baldwin, these relationships between men would start with some kind of romantic or erotic interest, and sometimes they would become that way for a while. Theirs never did. Instead, he called him his spiritual father, and they constructed this absolutely beautiful relationship. I think one of the things that Baldwin's life teaches us, to get back to your question about love, is that love, so much of our society, and I think it's fine and good, is based in love for people that we are biologically related to. That's just really written into sort of how we understand ourselves. And Baldwin did love his family, but Baldwin had this enormous capacity to love, to create communities that were not biologically. He talked about it. He thinks we're all brothers and sisters, actually. That's how he sees it. But he also created these communities. Buford Delaney was his spiritual father. Engin Cezar, the Turkish actor that he followed there, he called him his blood brother. When they were in Greenwich Village, they cut their arms and mixed their blood together and became blood brothers. So don't do that. But the point is that, he, I think, offers us a way of thinking beyond the kind of traditional, you can say heteronormative, but it's not just that. Traditional, because in the end of the day, racism is also rooted in this idea of biology and family, that there's one race, the white race, and that they are a family. And so Baldwin really cut against that, as we should.
It just dawned on me that he friend-zoned Buford.
Friends on him?
He friend-zoned Buford. Buford liked him.
Oh, yeah.
And he was like, how about you be my spiritual father and good friend for the rest of my life?
With no benefits.
With no benefits. That's the friend zone. All right. I grew up in the Northwest, Oregon. Should anybody here from Oregon? Probably not. Yeah, I didn't think so. I knew it was, this was gonna be hard.
Let me just say, last time we did an event was in Portland, and he's a rock star everywhere, but there it was this unbelievable reception. So, yeah, there's a lot to compete with there.
Or you see all these people here, and we're doing the same. I'm doing it with the same person, so we could also say that. Oregon never had slavery on the books, right? I think if you're from the Northwest, you kind of toot your horn that, we didn't participate in that. We didn't have slavery. But Oregon also was, I think, the only state was the only state admitted into the Union with an exclusion law against black people moving into the state when it was founded. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You think different about Keep Portland Weird now, don't you? We've both lived in New York, which New Yorkers love to tout how great they are. They got Mandani, and the Knicks are winning. Shout out to the Knicks. That's probably a bad. Okay, all right, I can say that here. I thought y'all was all Celtics fans. Yeah, all right, yeah. They're about to get rid of Jaylen Brown, but okay, that's another story. We both lived in New York, which is once a slave colony, and even afterwards was engaged in the fiscal persistence of slavery, right? And take this hammer, Baldwin wrote that there is no moral distance between the facts of life in San Francisco and the facts of life in Birmingham, Alabama. I think it's accurate to say the South right now is re-entrenching Jim Crow. I think it's also accurate to say the North and the West feel themselves superior to that kind of blatant racial hostility. What do you see now as the moral distance between the North and the moral distance between the South?
Zoran Mandami. No, I think that Baldwin, I think that truth does still hold, and I think that was such an important line for him to toe at the time. I mean, his 1964 meeting with RFK, this really famous meeting where RFK wanted to meet with him to solve the Negro problem in the North and make sure it didn't become as bad as it was in the South. And Baldwin's whole point in that meeting actually was to use that term. You have the moral obligation of the country. So I think we're in a very similar situation. People like Stacey Abrams are showing us just how crucial everything happening in the South is. So we're fortunate that we have people like her, right, who are doing this work. But unfortunately, Baldwin always said this, right? How much time do you want for your progress? That's one of the things that comes up. And I found myself thinking about those lines in recent months as well.
Yeah. I think we got a couple. I'm looking at the clock. If this is right up here, whoever. I ain't see the guy up here flashing no fingers yet, so I think I'm good. I want to stay in the 60s. 1965, Malcolm X is assassinated. You write that Baldwin's life could be divided into before Malcolm X was killed and after Malcolm X was assassinated. What do you see as the most important distinctions between the before period of that time and the after of that tremendous loss?
I mean, I think he just lost his hope. I mean, it was the same with the murder of Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King. When Baldwin got the news about Malcolm X, he was in London, and he really, really did not want to come back to the States. So I thought I might read a short excerpt from a letter from him because it involves Nantucket. It's the only time that I can find, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the only time I've seen Nantucket mentioned in Baldwin's life, really. So this is a letter that he's writing to a woman named Mary Painter, a white woman he met, economist, brilliant economist. He became friends with in Paris in his early years, and they remained, again, lifelong kind of family and friends. And he is writing about, he's also coming out of a bad breakup with Lucian. There's some drama on Broadway, but really, this is the first time he's coming back to the States in 1965 since the assassination of Malcolm X. After he boarded his flight on September 24th, 1965, he wrote a letter to Mary Painter that communicates just how emotionally rattled he was to be heading back to the States. Over Nantucket, he writes, or some such place, heavy indeed at heart. He was writing this by hand on Alitalia stationery. I have never traveled with so great and unshakable a burden of apprehension. Returning to America has never made me joyful, but never before has it made me sad. It is not so much that I fear being able to rise to the challenge, it is simply that I no longer feel the challenge worthwhile. If he was explicitly referencing America as a country, it is a doomed nation, he writes, a doomed people, but I am, underlined, an American and cannot shrug my shoulders. He was also, in a very real sense, lamenting his doomed relationship with Lucien. God, I shall order another whiskey, he closed in his letter to Mary. Write me, hold my hand.
There we go. Nantucket made famous by the great one. At this moment, we would like to open it up for questions. The mic is going to go around. Anyone? We have a question.
Nicholas, we know, this literally was an odyssey of your life. This is how many years, and why did you decide this is literally how you will spend the major portion of your intellectual, personal, really psychological and emotional life that you entered to create this masterpiece that really will stand in history? When did this begin? Did you have any idea what this would take?
I'll try to tell the short version because it is a long story, but the first time I saw James Baldwin's face was in my 8th grade English classroom in Washington, D.C. And it was my 8th, she'd put it on the wall with a bunch of famous black authors. I was one of the few white students in the public school. And that was my first memory. I thought that was it. But I recently, when the book came out, I spoke to my teacher and she said, no, Nick, you came in a week later in a suit and gave a presentation on Baldwin's whole life. So I've been working on this book for 40 some years, actually. But when I really sort of began the book was I was in college and I discovered this out-of-print children's book by James Baldwin, Little Man, at the Beinecke. This was 1996. I wrote an email to David Leeming, who wrote a very important early biography, saying, do you know anything about this French artist? And he wrote me back, I never met him. I don't know anybody alive who did, and I believe he's dead. So 7 years later, I moved to New York and I write a bunch of emails to art historians in Paris saying, do you know anything about this deceased French author, Joran Kazak? I suspected from Leeming's biography that this was a great lover of Baldwin's, but it was not written that way. And I leave my phone number, and a few weeks later, the phone rings in my studio apartment in Brooklyn, and it's this raspy French accented voice saying, this is Joran Kazak, I'm alive. Come to Paris, I have many stories to tell you about Jimmy. So that was 2003, and that really was the beginning of me getting, for lack of a better word, roped into this situation. Because I never set out to write a biography. I never set out to write a biography of James Baldwin. I would never have sort of the hubris to believe that I could do that. It just sort of happened incrementally. We got the book back into print, which took 15 years, the children's book, in 2018. And as I was interviewing Joran Kazak, I realized not only that he was Baldwin's last great love. He dedicated if Beale Street could talk to him, but he was married to a woman, and his son was Baldwin's godson. I met and interviewed them, and then I realized there was this massive pattern like this in Baldwin's life, and that in fact love was everywhere in all of his writing, fiction and nonfiction, and that we had to kind of look more closely at these relationships to truly understand Baldwin the man and also his creative process. But it really was not until 2018, when the Schomburg archives became available, that I realized I was writing a book about Baldwin, but I thought it was a book about these great loves. And then as I wrote it, I realized, well, if you're gonna tell the story of these great loves, you actually end up having to tell his whole life story, because that is the key to his whole life story.
Questions in the back. I see him. You see on the right side.
Hi, thank you. It's a beautifully written book. There seems to be a revival of interest in Baldwin. So can you explain why there was a decline and what has caused the revival, not only in his views about race, but his views about love and just the quality of his writing.
Thank you for your nice comment, but also for a great question, because it's very true. I mean, when Baldwin died in '87, he was still a household name, but his reputation was in steep decline. There was this kind of narrative, which was mostly the fault of kind of like white liberals, critics who he no longer was sort of writing for, felt he really was following Toni Morrison's advice about don't write for the white gaze from the '70s on, which is another part of their great friendship. But he'd been a darling of those folks in the '60s, writing for the New Yorker. I mean, you write something like The Fire Next Time about the hope of interracial coalition, you can get a lot of people excited. You start saying, like, how much time do you want for your progress? You start, aligning yourself more with a global vision of black liberation. There's less happiness there. But then also Baldwin's sexuality, some, not all, it can be overblown, but some black nationalists, like Eldridge Cleaver and others, really came for Baldwin. So he was sort of caught between these two critical establishments or groups where no one really wanted to claim him. What did happen beautifully in the '90s was you had the rise of folks like Essex Hemphill or Isaac Julian, really black queer artists and scholars who kind of kept his legacy alive during this kind of period in the '90s. And then in the early 2000s, you had the rise of Black Lives Matters, which of course then you see, Baldwin's words were, all of the decline narrative, we're like, wait a second, everything he was saying during this decline was true. He remained true to his vision. And then you had things like Raoul Peck's documentary, you had Barry Jenkins' film. So this was a long time in the making. He never fell away completely, but I think the extent to which there's two factors at play. And I think one is just that he's a first-rate artist, right? So he remains relevant. You can pick up Giovanni's Room or a novel and you can be moved by it. But he's also, in this era that we live in, on Instagram and on YouTube, he's such an incredible public speaker and figure. So he's really tailor-made for our moment. One of the things I wanted to do in this book because of that is that sometimes he can be oversimplified into this icon, right? And so I wanted to sort of tell the more human story as well, to make sure that as he rises into the prominence again that he deserves, we're getting the full Baldwin, not just these snippets that can be manipulated for different reasons. Because there are very conservative people out there who actually use Baldwin's arguments about race, right, as a construct to argue that we should all be colorblind, which is not what Baldwin was saying. So it's really important to read Baldwin closely in all his levels and multiplicities.
Hi, this was really very entertaining and very thought-provoking. I wanted to ask, you've talked so much about love of country or not, home or not. First part of the question is, how much did James Baldwin love himself or not? And of course then the reflection of that in his writing, in everything he did. And what might he say about today's social media obsession with self and the projection of self as a love of ourselves or not?
Good question. So for the first one, definitely his journey to self-love was extremely complicated because of what I described earlier, the way that he grew up. But not just that, the way that any young black child grows up in that era. He talks about watching movies like Cowboys and Indians and realizing, he's rooting for the Cowboys until he realized that he's the Indian, right? And so, and one of the amazing things about Baldwin, and actually folks like Eldridge Cleaver had problems with this with him because I don't think they read him correctly. He wrote early essays about his shame that his people had not created Rembrandt or created Shakespeare, okay? But that was talking about when he was younger, right? And then he wrote about how it wasn't until he discovered jazz and the blues that he understood that black music was his inheritance more than the history of American literature. Baldwin was willing to go into those vulnerable spaces of, self-hatred might be too strong, but of self-doubt, of self-erasure, of all of that. So I think, the journey to self-love for all of us is a complicated one and never full, I don't believe. But I believe that he certainly came to a point of, he understood, even though he died too young, what he had accomplished. He understood that he was loved, and that's part of why I wrote the book, because another narrative is that, oh, this poor homosexual, he never found true love, and I wanted to show that actually he did find it in these kinds of expansive, shifting relationships and communities, that in fact that narrative wasn't quite right. As for your second question, I always try not to say, speak for Baldwin, because he was so idiosyncratic and he changed his mind about a lot of things. But in terms of like social media, I do think he is such an avatar now on social media that it's interesting. You can't not talk about it. And B, interestingly, he was kind of writing about these problems in his late life. So I talked about the essay about gender, but he was also writing his last book, which was sort of uneven, was about the Atlanta child murders, the evidence of things not seen. And in that book, he really does reporting in that book. He is writing about this odd moment in the history of racism in which there used to be a kind of absence of representations of African Americans on screens. Negative ones, but also kind of an absence. And then suddenly, with the Atlanta child murders, there's just a saturation of images of black criminality. And it made me, and people have written about this, Elizabeth Alexander has written about this, Imani Perry, but we're living in this moment now where especially young people can pick up their phones and they can see their peers, their African-American peers or white peers, being traumatized, being shot at, being assaulted. So Baldwin, I think, would have a lot to say about what does it mean to live in a culture now where we're like beyond the question even of self-love. We're at the question of survival, right? Like, what does it mean for young people in particular to be kind of desensitized almost to the idea of guns, to the idea that the police can attack people, without reason. So I think that's one of the arenas that he would have insights that I can only imagine and conjecture about.
I think that is it. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Nicholas. Yeah.